denizens of the night. Welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Tonight, I've got 4 back-to-back Halloween horror stories lined up for you, courtesy of Weird Suggestion 152. First up, we've got a story set in Appalachia. It's called In Deep Appalachia, Halloween Night Comes with Rules. After that, we'll hear about a Halloween potluck gone sideways in the story The Year My Office's Halloween Potluck Ended in Horror. Then, we'll follow a young man as he is stalked on Halloween night in Last Halloween, I Was Stalked by the Devil. And rounding out the collection, we have What I Saw on Halloween in 1998 Still Haunts Me, where a group of young boys learn that not every house welcomes trick-or-treaters. A special thank you to the author for generously allowing us to enjoy these stories. And without further ado, let's begin our descent into terror. I've lived my entire life in a holler on the outskirts of Wyoming County, West Virginia, deep in the mountains of Appalachia. It's a place so remote most folks don't even know it exists on a map. Just a handful of families and dense, unforgiving woods. This place doesn't have neighborhoods, doesn't have sidewalks, and most definitely does not have trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Halloween isn't a holiday here. It's a test. My family, and the others who've lived here long enough to know, follow a set of rules on Halloween night. It's not tradition or superstition. It's survival. Those who don't follow the rules didn't live long enough to tell anyone about it. Our rules aren't just about keeping doors locked or avoiding dark places. They're specific, with reasons rooted in events we don't talk about. My dad always said they came from my great-grandmother's time, when people came to these mountains from Scotland and still believed in the old ways. Whether it's spirits or something else that's out there, or things just too old to name, Halloween night here has always been a game of life and death, and each rule existed to give you just enough of an edge to make it through till morning. The first time I broke a rule, I learned why they exist, and I'll never forget it. Every October, around the second week, the rules went up on the fridge. We lived by them. My family took them seriously, and not just in a keep the kids safe kind of way. No, these rules were for everyone. Break one, and you'd put us all in danger. Here's how they go. Number 1. If you hear 3 knocks at the door after sunset, do not answer. Number 2. If you hear a single hard knock, open the door, but do not look at who stands there. Hold out a basket of freshly baked bread and wait until you hear the footsteps leaving to shut the door. Number 3. If you hear someone call your name from the woods, do not answer. Number 4. If you see a figure at the tree line wearing a wide-brimmed hat, do not look at him for longer than 1 second. Number 5. If you hear chains dragging on the ground, sprinkle salt on all windowsills and door thresholds within 1 minute. Number 6. If a candle is burning in the window of the old abandoned Anderson cabin up the hill, stay indoors no matter what. These rules didn't exist for no reason. They were handed down because bad things had happened. People vanished, people died, and strange things occurred. That's just how it was. I remember one specific year, years back, when Halloween night fell on a full moon. The air felt different, charged. My dad had a sense for when things were going to be bad. You could just feel it in the holler, thick in the air, like something breathing down your neck. Dad told us to get all the preparations done early. "Salt the windows now," he instructed, standing by the door, his face tight with worry. "We're not waiting for the chains." I followed his orders without question, pouring salt along each windowsill and at the front and back door thresholds. My brother was baking bread, already anticipating rule number 2, the one we hated the most. It was the one that forced us to interact with whatever knocked, whatever stood on the other side of that door. We never knew who or what it was, but we knew if you didn't offer bread or if you dared to look, it wouldn't be good. By late afternoon, the house was fortified. The bread was cooling on the counter, its smell filling the kitchen. The fire was lit, burning low, and a 12-gauge lay across Dad's lap like it always did on Halloween. Isaac, my younger brother, sat closest to the window, glancing out every now and then. We had about 3 hours before sunset. The rules were clear. Everything bad happened after dark. But the waiting was the worst part. The longer we sat there, the more anxious we became. "Do we use enough salt this year?" Isaac asked quietly. Dad didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, gripping the gun tighter. That was answer enough. The first knock came just after dark. A single knock, slow and deliberate. Isaac and I froze, staring at the door. Dad stood up, motioning for us to stay back and be quiet. I swallowed hard, heart pounding in my chest. It was time to follow Rule 2. Without a word, Dad picked up the basket of bread from the counter, freshly baked, still warm. He walked to the door, resting one hand on the knob. "Remember," he said, his voice low and steady. "Don't look." He opened the door just wide enough to slip the basket through the crack, his eyes focused on the floor. The warm smell of the bread wafted out, and I could hear a faint shuffling on the porch. Whoever or whatever it was out there. I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching across the porch, but I didn't dare look. Dad held the basket out, his hand shaking slightly. For a few heartbeats, there was no sound, no movement. And then, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, retreating from the porch. He waited until they faded completely, then shut the door quietly, locking it tight. Isaac let out a breath. "Why don't we just leave the bread out early? Why do we have to wait for the knock?" Dad's face was pale, and his eyes were hard. "We have to wait for the knock, and if we don't answer the knock, it'll come in." We thought it was over. We had followed Rule 2 to the letter, and for a moment it seemed like things were quiet. But here, nothing stays quiet for long on Halloween. Isaac was the first to notice him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just where the trees meet the clearing. He was tall and thin, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he was there, watching. Isaac gasped, pointing. "It's him!" he whispered, voice trembling. Dad didn't need to ask who. He knew. We all did. The man in the hat. "Don't look at him," Dad snapped. "Not for more than a second." I glanced, just enough to confirm he was there. A tall, dark figure, almost blending into the shadows of the trees, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. I looked away quickly, heart hammering in my chest. We got away from the doors and windows of the house and sat huddled in the living room, the fire our only light. Outside, the man in the hat stood at the tree line, unmoving as the night crept on. It wasn't until after midnight that we heard the chains. At first, it was faint, a metallic clinking that seemed distant, almost like it could have been the wind. But it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The sound of chains being dragged across the rocky ground outside. Isaac's face turned pale. He shot me a look, wide-eyed and terrified. "The salt," he whispered. Dad nodded grimly. "Go check." I got up slowly, trying to control the tremor in my legs. I circled the house, inspecting every window and door frame. The salt lines were intact. Nothing had disturbed them. The chains continued to scrape outside, dragging closer and closer, but we didn't dare open the door. We didn't dare look. We stayed inside, sitting together in the flickering light of the fire, listening to the sound of the chains until the first light of dawn broke through the windows. We had made it through the night. The man in the hat was gone. The chains had stopped. But as the morning light seeped through the shutters, I glanced toward the old Anderson cabin up the hill, and there it was, a single candle still burning in the window. The rules are clear. When the candle burns in the Anderson cabin, you stay inside. No exceptions, no excuses. Even with the sun beginning to shine and the birds beginning to chirp, the sight of that candle filled me with a primal fear. We have to wait until the candle goes out before we can go outside, before the night is truly over. And that's how it goes here. The rules aren't just there to be followed. They're there to keep you alive. And if you're smart, you don't ask questions. Sometimes, it's better not to know. Halloween here had always been terrifying, but last year was different. It wasn't just the usual unease or the normal anxiety that came with the setting sun. It almost felt like the rules weren't enough anymore. My dad was getting older, his movements slower, his hands a little less steady. We all knew it, but no one said anything. We just followed the rules, like always, hoping that would be enough. We spent the day in preparation, salting the windows, baking the bread, the usual. Isaac and I were jittery, pacing around, double-checking everything. With my dad getting older, we felt a greater pressure to take it upon ourselves to prepare. The sky darkened faster than usual, clouds rolling in from the west, blotting out the last rays of the sun. By the time dusk fell, the fire was burning low, and the house sat in darkness. Dad sat in his usual spot by the door, the shotgun across his lap. The basket of bread, fresh out of the oven, sat next to him. We all waited, our hearts pounding in the silence. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see the figure in the hat or hear the drag of chains. And then it came. A single knock, loud and deliberate. Dad stood up, just like every other year. "Stay put," he muttered, picking up the basket with his trembling hands. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. Isaac and I exchanged a nervous glance as Dad approached the door. As always, I stared at the floor, focusing on the sound of the crackling fire and trying to block out the sense of dread that had settled in my gut. He opened the door a crack, just enough to push the basket through without seeing whatever waited on the other side. But this time, something went wrong. As Dad leaned forward, he knocked the basket against the doorframe and lost his grip. The bread tumbled out, scattering across the porch. The sudden movement, the noise. Without thinking, I looked up. I looked at it, and I saw it. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything I could name. It stood hunched over, far too tall to be human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its face was sunken, like a skull with pale white skin pulled tight over it, and its eyes were wild and wide, too wide, like it didn't have eyelids. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, a black, gaping hole that emitted a horrible, deafening wail. It was a sound I had never heard before, like metal scraping against stone, but worse. It drilled into my skull, making my ears ring and my vision blur. Before I could react, before I could even scream, the thing lunged. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing my dad by the collar. In one terrifyingly quick motion, it yanked him off the porch, dragging him toward the woods. The sound of his body scraping against the ground, his muffled cries and the creature's horrible wail all blurred together into a scene of pure terror. Isaac screamed first. I was frozen, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. But Isaac's scream jolted me back to reality. "Dad!" Isaac yelled, bolting for the door. I followed, my legs shaking and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. We ran out into the cold night air, toward the edge of the woods where we could still hear Dad's faint cries. But before we could take more than a few steps, I saw it. The candle. A single flickering light in the window of the old Anderson cabin. My blood ran cold. We had come outside when the candle was burning. I grabbed Isaac's arm, pulling him to a stop. "Wait," I whispered, voice shaking. "The cabin!" As if on cue, the door of the cabin suddenly flew open with a loud crash, as if something unseen was about to come storming out. Something angry. Something that should not have been awakened. "We have to go!" I shouted, dragging Isaac back toward our house. We scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut behind us. I locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. The shotgun was still on the floor by Dad's chair, but it felt useless. What good would it do against something like that? But the night was far from over. We huddled in the living room, terrified, waiting for the next rule to break. Isaac was crying, his hands shaking as he tried to steady his breathing. I stared at the door, half expecting something to come crashing through at any moment. The chains came next. We heard them clattering on the ground, dragging closer and closer. I grabbed the bag of salt, getting ready to double-check the lines of salt we'd placed down earlier. The chains dragged right up to the front door, the metallic clinking echoing in the silence. I could hear it just outside, scraping against the wooden steps of the porch. But I knew the salt would hold. It always did. Or so I thought. Isaac was the first to notice it. We had forgotten to resalt the front door threshold after going outside. The wind from the open door had disturbed our salt line. Just as I was about to rush toward the door to resalt it, I heard the chains and a creaking against the door. It sounded as though a heavy weight was slowly leaning against it. I knew we didn't have time. I began to back away, motioning to Isaac to go to the bedroom. Isaac screamed as the door burst open. We ran into the back bedroom, hearts pounding, breaths coming in ragged gasps. I quickly salted in front of the door to the bedroom and checked the windows. "It's in the house," I whispered. I could feel it, a presence, something cold and malevolent, creeping through the house toward us. I don't know how long we waited, or how long we listened to the chains pacing back and forth through our house. Eventually, we heard them go back outside. Slowly, we left the bedroom and quietly closed and locked the front door. I placed a fresh line of salt in front of the door and breathed a sigh of relief. We were safe for now. And then we heard it again. A knock. But not the single knock, and not the 3 knocks. This was something new, something that didn't fit the rules. It was a rapid, frantic pounding, as if whatever was out there wanted in. Now. My heart stopped. The rules didn't cover this. Isaac looked at me, eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The pounding grew louder, more desperate. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. Whatever was out there was angry, angrier than anything I had ever felt before. "We just wait," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. "We wait until daylight." The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Every minute felt like an hour. Every sound made my heart leap into my throat. We didn't sleep. We didn't dare move from the living room. We huddled together in front of the fire, clutching the shotgun like it was our last hope, and quietly crying over the loss of our father. The pounding on the door never stopped. The chains outside the house dragged back and forth, a constant reminder of the horror that waited just beyond the walls. And through it all, the candle in the Anderson cabin burned bright, flickering in the distance like a beacon of death. But somehow, we made it. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the sounds stopped. The pounding ceased. The chains fell silent. The candle in the cabin flickered out. We had survived another year, barely. But Dad never came back. Halloween in our holler had always been a test. But last year, it wasn't enough. Breaking the rules cost my dad his life, and everything is different. And I can't shake the feeling that this Halloween will be worse. It was just another Thursday at the office. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I sat at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen. I should have been working on my monthly budget report, but all I could think about was the ache in my stomach and the impending doom of the yearly office Halloween party. As if summoned by my thoughts, the office began to buzz with excitement. I could hear the chatter of my coworkers from behind my cubicle, hollow laughter and manufactured enthusiasm as they decorated their cubicles with cobwebs, orange lights, and plastic skeletons. It was the same every year, a forced camaraderie that had always felt more like a chore than a celebration. "Hey, Aaron, you ready for the potluck?" Sarah from accounting called out as she passed my desk, her bright orange sweater clashing with the bland beige walls. "Yeah, totally," I replied, not bothering to look up from my screen. My heart wasn't in it. I'd felt sick for days, but I couldn't leave. Back-to-back illnesses had drained my sick leave, and my company attendance rating had taken a massive hit. I couldn't afford to miss any more time. Sarah bounced away, leaving me with my thoughts. I never understood the appeal of these office gatherings. It was as if everyone had decided that pretending to enjoy each other's company for a few hours was worth the effort of dressing up and bringing food. But I didn't care. The only thing I wanted was to survive the day and go home and crawl in my bed. I clicked through spreadsheets, trying to focus on the report due next week, but my stomach churned uneasily. It made me feel even less inclined to partake in the festivities. Yet there I was, making chocolate chip cookies the night before. I had even drizzled an orange icing and pressed some candy corn into them for good measure. "Those look cute," a voice chirped from behind me. It was Susan, the self-proclaimed office party planner. She was wearing a glittery witch hat and a dress covered in plastic bats. "Oh, thanks," I replied, forcing a smile. "Are you going to try my dish?" Susan beamed, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "What did you make?" I asked, despite myself. "Witch's brew pudding," she exclaimed. "It's a secret recipe. You'll love it." I managed a nod, though my stomach turned at the thought of eating whatever concoction she'd cooked up. "Sounds great." "Just you wait," Susan winked, before skipping off to her desk, leaving me with a strange mix of dread and reluctance. As the clock inched closer to noon, the buzz of excitement grew louder, permeating every corner of the office. One by one, my coworkers filed into the break room, each unveiling their own Halloween-themed creations. There were the usual suspects: a bowl of ghostly pasta salad, cupcakes decorated like monsters, and red punch that bubbled in a plastic cauldron. The smell of various dishes wafted through the air, competing with the sharp scent of cleaning products and warm copy paper that never quite went away. I stood back, watching as everyone got in line for the buffet table, filling their plates with colorful food, laughing and mingling like they were old friends. I couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. As I surveyed the spread, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My body was protesting, begging me not to eat anything. "Just a few more hours," I whispered to myself, clenching my jaw in frustration. When I finally mustered the courage to grab a plate, I filled it with a few of the safer options: some chips, one of my cookies, and a very light scoop of Susan's pudding, mostly to avoid her relentless questioning about whether I had tried it. "Hey, Aaron, let me know what you think of the pudding," Susan insisted, appearing beside me like a ghost, her excitement palpable. "I changed my recipe this year." "Oh, how'd you make it?" I asked, feigning interest. "Oh, you know." She waved a hand dismissively. "Just an old family recipe. But this year I added a little something to give it a kick. I promise, it's delicious." I forced a laugh, the ache creeping back into my gut. "Sure, yeah, I'll give it a try." The laughter around me grew louder, but I barely heard it. I was watching the small group of coworkers clustered around the punch bowl. They were sharing stories and laughter, but it felt like a mask. Everyone seemed to just be pretending to enjoy each other's company when we were merely co-workers navigating through the corporate grind. As the clock ticked toward 1 p.m., I settled at a corner table, trying to stay unnoticed. It was quiet here, and I felt more at ease away from the clamor. I nibbled at the chips, but the heaviness in my stomach made it hard to enjoy anything. I began to get that cold sweat feeling you get right before you hurl. I closed my eyes, trying to take a minute for myself, when suddenly a scream pierced the air, cutting through the laughter like a knife. My heart raced as I turned to see Jennifer from marketing clutching her throat, her face turning an alarming shade of red. "Oh my God!" someone shouted. "What's happening?" I said. "Is she choking?" Eddie from IT yelled, rushing to her side. I watched in horror as Jennifer staggered back, her hands desperately clawing at her throat. Panic spread through the room as more people turned toward the commotion. She fell to the ground, gasping for air, and within moments she lay motionless, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "Someone help her!" I screamed, my voice barely cutting through the rising chaos. The laughter that had filled the air only moments ago turned to shouts of confusion and terror. A few people rushed toward Jennifer, but as they approached, I saw Eddie clutch his stomach, his face contorting in agony. "Ugh!" he groaned, doubling over. A wave of nausea crashed over me, the feeling of panic and fear mixing with the already present feeling of illness. My pulse quickened, and bile began to rise in my throat. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. "Eddie!" Sarah cried, rushing to his side as he fell to his knees, retching violently. The sound was horrifying, guttural, desperate. I could see the remnants of the red punch he'd just consumed spew onto the floor, mixed with bile. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah yelled, backing away. I didn't want to believe it, but something felt wrong. More than just the flu season or a simple case of bad food. From my corner of the room, I watched as panic spread like wildfire. People began to collapse, one by one, faces turning purple, their bodies seizing as if gripped by an invisible hand. I spotted Susan at the edge of the crowd, her eyes wide with shock. "Call 911!" someone shouted, but the chaos drowned out any rational thoughts. No one was thinking straight anymore. The office, once filled with laughter and the smell of baked goods, transformed into a scene from a nightmare. Sarah fell next, her mouth foaming as she tried to scream, but only choked sounds escaped her lips. Panic morphed into pure horror. All of my co-workers were now sprawled across the ground, some convulsing, a red, viscous liquid coming from their mouths. Others now lay completely still. I vomited into a trash can, the mix of fear, adrenaline, and illness all finally coming to a head. "Aaron," Susan's voice pierced the noise, startling me. "You have to try the pudding." "Are you insane?" I shouted. "You're worried about your stupid pudding? Look at everyone!" Susan smiled, unnaturally calm in the chaos. "Month after month, year after year, birthdays, holidays, I pour my heart into this office. I plan the parties. I buy all the decorations. And what do I get? Nothing. I'm never appreciated. I see the ways people roll their eyes when I pass by. But this Halloween is different. Now they'll see. They should have appreciated me." I took a step back, my heart racing. "The pudding? What did you do to it?" "Oh, it's a secret family recipe," Susan insisted, but her frantic demeanor was starting to unnerve me. Her smile had slipped, revealing something darker lurking beneath the surface. More bodies crumpled to the floor, and the stench of sweat and vomit filled the air. I stumbled, narrowly avoiding tripping over the limp body of Eddie, now lying face first on the ground. My stomach lurched, and I pressed a hand over my mouth to stifle the rising nausea. "Somebody help! Please!" I called out, but no one answered. Everyone was too busy succumbing to the terror that had been unleashed by Susan. I felt trapped, suffocated by the chaos, frozen in fear. The room fell eerily silent, except for the sounds of my own ragged breathing. The realization hit me hard. Everyone was gone. All my co-workers, people I'd shared mundane conversations with over coffee for years, were now all lifeless on the floor. It felt surreal, like a scene from a horror film. I felt like I was trapped in a bad dream. "Aaron," Susan said in a sing-song voice, cutting through my thoughts, and I turned to see her now standing in front of the exit with a manic gleam in her eyes. "You don't understand. You're going to try it, whether you want to or not." I shook my head, panic flooding my veins. You crazy bitch! You killed them! You poisoned them!" Her laughter echoed off the walls, a sharp, discordant sound that sent chills down my spine. "Yes! And now it's your turn!" "No!" I screamed, turning to run. I turned around, frantically looking for somewhere to escape to. I dashed into my boss's office, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My mind raced as I frantically tried to figure out my next move. I could hear Susan pounding on the door, her voice rising in fury and desperation. "Aaron, you're the only one left. You're all alone." My heart raced as I backed away, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I glanced around the room, spotting my boss slumped over, completely still, vomit now covering his overpriced desk. The sight sent a fresh wave of dread through me. He hadn't made it either. The realization that I was alone, trapped in a room with a lifeless body, began to overwhelm me. I felt the weight of despair crushing me, and I fought back tears as I began to come to terms with my own mortality. That was until I spotted the phone, covered in vomit on my boss's desk. I picked up the phone, pressing the warm, wet receiver to my ear, and dialed 911, doing my best to stifle the vomit rising in my throat. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice finally came through, and I nearly sobbed with relief. People are dead! Please, send help! I cried, my voice trembling as I glanced back at the door. Sir, can you tell me your location? I stuttered out the address, heart racing. You have to hurry! There's a woman! She's trying to kill me! Stay calm. Help is on the way. Are you in a safe place? I think so, I whispered, glancing toward the door. But she's right outside! She's freaking crazy! Stay where you are and lock the door. Can you barricade yourself? I looked around frantically, searching for something to use. Just then, the door rattled violently, and Susan's voice slithered through the crack. You can't hide forever, Aaron. You belong with the others. Just a taste. Just a little taste. No, I yelled, my voice shaking. Her laughter echoed outside as the operator's voice continued to try and calm me, but it faded into the background as I focused on the sounds around me. I could hear Susan breathing heavily on the other side. I could hear her shuffling and pacing, looking for ways to get in. I heard a loud crash and the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. My blood ran cold as I realized she found a way in. She had used a fire extinguisher to break through the glass wall surrounding my boss's office. She pushed her way through the blinds, the bowl of pudding in her hands. Just a little scoop. I promise, it won't even hurt. My mind raced as I searched the room for anything that could help me. Get away from me, Susan! I yelled. With an unsettling calm, she dipped her fingers into the pudding and lunged forward. Before I could defend myself, Susan was on me. I tried to fight her off, but she was deceptively strong. She pressed her fingers to my lips, forcing the sickening mixture toward my mouth. I thrashed, but she was relentless, her laughter echoing off the walls, a twisted melody of joy and madness. After all these years of giving, it's finally my time. Just then, the sound of police echoed through the hallways. Show us your hands! Susan's face twisted in rage. No! Don't take this from me! Eat it now! The officers approached the office, guns drawn at Susan, but she didn't relent. Instead, she lunged at me harder, eyes wild with fury. A shot rang out, the noise deafening, as one of the officers fired. The sound of impact splattered against the wall beside me. Susan crumpled to the ground, her eyes wide. Blood and brains sprayed across the office, a gruesome painting that covered me in the aftermath of her madness. As the officers rushed to my side, the chaos around us dulled into an eerie stillness. They called for backup, but all I could do was stare at Susan, lifeless on the floor, her bowl of poison now spilling onto the carpet. Days later, the investigation unveiled the horror of Susan's obsession. They discovered her home, a shrine dedicated to her co-workers, adorned with clippings, printed emails, photographs, and a diary filled with erratic writings. Each page revealed her unhinged thoughts, rants about how no one appreciated her, how she felt invisible. While I survived, that day has stuck with me forever. After receiving a sizable settlement from the company, I moved cities and now work retail. No more office parties, no more cubicles, and most definitely, no more Halloween potlucks. I was working the closing shift at Footworks, the shoe store crammed into the far corner of the Chapel Hills Mall. Halloween was supposed to be a night of fun, but instead, I was stuck stocking sneakers for minimum wage. I only had a half hour left on my shift, and I could feel the seconds crawling by. The clock on my phone felt frozen at 7:30 p.m. I drummed my fingers on the counter, trying to stay awake. My manager, who was supposed to help close, had ducked out for an early smoke break and never came back. Most of the customers had already thinned out, but there were still a few stragglers wandering around the mall. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my friend Ben. "Yo, you coming tonight or what?" I sighed. I'd been dodging the question all day. Ben's Halloween party was supposed to be the big event of the night. Half of the school was going, including all of my friends. But I hadn't planned on going. After my shift was over, all I really wanted to do was just crash in my bed. I started typing, "Probably not," when another text popped up. "Don't be lame, man. It's Halloween." I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the keyboard. It had been a while since I'd done anything fun, and even though I didn't have a costume, I could probably grab something cheap from the Halloween store on the way. I wasn't exactly Mr. Social, but maybe it wouldn't hurt to get out of the house for once. "Yo!" a voice called from the store entrance, breaking my introspection. I looked up and saw Ben and Derek walking into the store like they owned the place. Ben flashed a grin, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Come on, bro. You're not getting out of this one. You're coming tonight," Ben said, leaning against the counter. Derek nodded, smirking. "Yeah, man, you never come to anything. You didn't show up last year either." "Look," I started. "I'm just tired, and I don't even have a costume, and I don't even have time to—" "You've got time," Ben interrupted. "The party doesn't start until 10. Grab something cheap and just show up. It's not like you have anything better to do." I sighed. They weren't wrong. As much as I wanted to protest, I started to give in to the pressure. Ben raised an eyebrow, a smirk growing on his face, anticipating my answer. "Fine," I muttered. "I'll come, but I probably won't stay long." "Yes! There he is!" Ben grinned, patting me on the shoulder. "You're gonna have a good time, bud. Trust me." Derek glanced at his watch. "All right, well, we're heading out. See you there." I watched them leave, their laughter fading as they disappeared out of the mall. I wasn't sure I believed Ben about having a good time, but I was locked in now. I just had to make it through the last stretch of my shift, grab a costume, and then down a few drinks to make the night more tolerable. The mall was basically empty now. Most of the other stores were now closed, and the place began to get a little darker as more and more lights were turned off. I started mentally checking off the closing tasks. Sweep the floor, cash out the register, routine stuff. As I was counting the minutes to clock out, something caught my eye near the entrance. A person stood there, just outside the store, facing me. They were in a Halloween costume. A creepy red latex devil mask, which had a large pointy nose and a cartoonish wide smile which reached ear to ear. Small black horns protruded from the top of the mask. It looked pretty realistic, like one of those expensive movie-quality masks. Had it not been so startling, it would have actually been pretty impressive. The mask was paired with a mismatched black and red suit that looked like it was put together from pieces found at a thrift store. At first, I assumed it was just a last-minute shopper or someone probably killing time before heading to a party, but they stood completely still, facing me, not moving, not browsing, not shopping, just standing there. I felt my chest tighten. There was no reason to be freaked out by some weirdo in a Halloween costume, but something about them made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The way they were just standing still, watching me, began to eat away at my nerves. I was about to tell him, "We're closed," when he turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked away. I just stared, frozen in place. His steps were slow, measured, almost robotic as he disappeared out of sight. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath the entire time. What the hell was that about? I thought. Just some creep messing around, probably. It was Halloween, after all. I shook it off, trying to refocus on closing the store and getting out of there. But every few seconds, I found myself glancing toward the entrance, half expecting to see that creepy guy in a devil mask there again, watching me. By the time I finally clocked out, I was beat and my nerves were shot. I made my way out of the now empty mall toward my car, checking behind my shoulder every few seconds. I safely made it to my car, now fully convinced that the person, whoever it was simply messing around with me. I brushed off the feeling and headed to the Halloween store to pick up a costume for the party. The Halloween store was one of those pop-up stores that showed up every year, taking over abandoned sporting goods stores and the like. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, a chime sound ringing loudly in the nearly empty store. The place was a mess. Shelves were mostly empty now, and decorations were scattered all over the floor, with a few straggling shoppers picking over the scraps. The sound of Halloween music played faintly through the speakers. I wandered aimlessly, searching for any scraps of a costume. The aisles were nearly bare, but I kept looking, feeling the pressure of time build. Suddenly, the music cut off, leaving the store in an uncomfortable silence. I knew I didn't have much time before they closed, so I hurried, eyes darting over the shelves. The door chimed again. Someone else had come in, but I didn't bother to look. I was too focused. At the end of one aisle, I found a small rack with cheap knockoff masks of famous movie killers. I grabbed a plastic Jason-style mask, headed for the register, rushing to get out. As I turned the corner, my heart lurched. There he was, the man in the devil mask. He stood at the far end of the aisle, illuminated by the dim, flickering light. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me. My stomach twisted and my throat went dry. No frickin' way, I thought, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. He stood perfectly still, just staring. For a split second, I considered throwing the mask down and bolting. But something kept me rooted. Maybe it was disbelief, maybe shock. I told myself it was a coincidence, forcing my legs to carry me to the front. The cashier barely looked up from his phone as I approached, too busy scrolling. My skin crawled as I sensed the man in the devil mask moving closer, his eyes locked on me. I could feel it, the weight of his stare boring into me. "Just this," I muttered, tossing the cheap mask onto the counter. It felt so pointless, but at least I wouldn't show up to Ben's party without something. The cashier rang it up slowly, the beeps of the register cutting through the heavy silence. I kept my head down, resisting the urge to look back, but I knew he was still there, watching me. "That'll be $10.53, the cashier said, snapping his gum, finally glancing up at me. I handed him the crumpled bills, my hand shaking slightly as I grabbed the change and shoved the mask into a bag. Without another word, I made a quick escape toward the exit. The bell chimed again as I pushed through the door, and the cold night air hit me like a splash of water. I exhaled sharply, tension easing from my shoulders. Instinctively, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him, the man in the devil mask, standing at the entrance, following me still. But there was nothing, just the empty store and a couple of people loitering on the sidewalk. He was gone, again. I shook my head and got in my car. I kept reminding myself, it's Halloween. Creepiness was just part of it. And besides, I had bigger things to worry about, like not making an idiot of myself at Ben's party. By the time I got to Ben's place, the party was already in full swing. Cars were parked up and down the block, and I could hear the bass from the music thumping before I even stepped out of my car. The house was decorated to the nines, fake cobwebs hanging from the trees, jack-o'-lanterns lining the walkway, and orange lights flickering in the windows. I could hear Rob Zombie's Dragula blasting from inside the house. I pulled the plastic hockey mask out of the bag and slipped it over my face. It wasn't much, but it would do. I didn't feel like going all out for this party anyway. I just wanted to blend in, have a few drinks, and hopefully avoid any awkward moments with people. The front door was wide open, and people were spilling out into the yard, already tipsy and laughing too loud. I stepped inside, and the smell of beer and sweat hit me immediately. Ben's living room was packed. People in costumes, some elaborate and some as half-assed as mine, dancing, drinking, and yelling over the blaring music. "Hey, you actually came!" Ben appeared out of nowhere, clapping me on the back hard enough to nearly knock me over. He was wearing a vampire costume, complete with fake blood dripping from his mouth. "Yeah, well, you didn't really give me a choice," I said jokingly, raising my voice to be heard over the music. "Here, grab a drink!" Ben shouted, shoving a plastic cup of beer into my hand before I could protest. "We're playing beer pong in the kitchen! Come on!" I hesitated. Beer pong wasn't really my thing, but it was better than standing around awkwardly in the corner. "Sure, yeah, why not?" I followed him into the kitchen, where a crowd had gathered around a table lined with orange plastic cups. Someone had set up a fog machine, and the room was filled with swirling white mist, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. I took a swig of beer and tried to relax. It was just a party, after all. We played several rounds. The beer had begun to do its job with loosening me up, and I was actually starting to have fun. For a moment, I even began to question myself on why I didn't come out more. But just as that thought occurred, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again. The figure, that devil mask, that long, pointy nose and wide smile. He was standing in the living room, just beyond the edge of the crowd, perfectly still, like he had been at the store. He didn't move or try to talk to anyone. He just stood there, watching me. My throat went dry, and my stomach twisted into knots. What the hell was he doing here? How did he follow me here? I blinked, half expecting him to disappear like a trick of the light. But when I looked again, he was still there. He raised his hand and gave me a slow, taunting wave, and turned to leave. Maybe it was the drinks, Or maybe it was the feeling of security from the crowd, but anger began to boil up inside me. I set my drink down and pushed through the crowd, trying to keep him in sight. I wanted to grab him and find out who he was and why the hell he was following me. But by the time I reached the living room, he was gone. Just like that. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. People were laughing, talking, and dancing like nothing was wrong. I thought about telling Ben, but what could I say? That some weirdo in a devil mask had been following me around all night? He'd just think I was being paranoid. I needed to calm down. I told myself it was just some guy playing a prank. Maybe someone who'd been at the mall earlier and recognized me. Or maybe it was someone I knew just messing with me. It was Halloween. People were supposed to be creepy. I grabbed another beer, took a long drink, and forced myself to relax. It was just in my head. It's nothing to worry about. I didn't stay at the party long after that. After a couple more beers and some awkward small talk, I made my excuses and slipped out. I just wasn't in the mood anymore. All I could think about was that guy. Every time I turned around, I expected to see him and his devil mask standing there just watching. It was a relief to get back to my car and leave the noise and chaos behind. The streets were quiet as I drove home, the occasional group of teenagers in costumes still wandering the sidewalks. My parents' house was only a few blocks away, and when I pulled into the driveway, everything seemed peaceful. The porch light was on, and the pumpkins were lit on the front porch. I parked and walked up the front steps, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked the door. The quiet was almost comforting after the noise of the party. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. They had probably gone to bed already. I flipped on the hallway light and headed for the stairs, planning to just crash in my room and forget about the whole night. But something stopped me. A sound, a drip. A slow, steady drip. Not the drip of a sink, a heavier, thicker drip. Slowly, I made my way toward the sound in the direction of the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes scanned around the house. As I got closer to the kitchen, the sound got louder, and there was something else, a smell, an odd smell, almost like copper, thick in the air. I rounded the corner into the kitchen when I saw the outline of something. No, not something, someone. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was my dad. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and so was my mom. Only something was wrong. They were sitting at the table, side by side, like they had been waiting for me. But there was something horribly wrong. So wrong that it took my brain a moment to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Their heads were gone. The jagged red stumps of their necks were all that remained, blood streaking down their clothes, pooling onto the floor. The table, once warm and familiar, was now soaked in it. My stomach lurched, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I stood frozen, in shock, every muscle locked in place as my brain struggled to process the nightmare in front of me. At first, I wasn't able to comprehend if what I was seeing was real or some twisted hallucination. And then I saw him. The man, the devil, was standing in the corner, almost blending into the shadows. He was big, much bigger up close, and his posture was unnervingly calm. In each hand, he held a head, their heads, by the hair, the thick strands twisted around his fingers. In his hands, I saw the source of the sound. Blood dripped from their severed heads, landing on the tiled floor with a soft, rhythmic plip, plip, plip. The sound was horrible, and for a moment all I could hear was the sound of the dripping and my own heartbeat. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, perfectly still. His arms were reached up toward me, holding my parents' heads proudly like two trophies. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in fear. I slowly backed away, step by step, my eyes never leaving him. His head didn't turn, his body didn't shift. He just stared with that pointy nose, that huge red smile, as if he were frozen in time. I kept moving backward, my chest tightening with every inch I gained. The last thing I saw before I turned and ran was the man still standing there in the corner, heads dangling from his hands, utterly motionless, his cold eyes boring into me. He never moved, and somehow that was worse. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers barely worked as I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I told the operator what had happened. When the police arrived, the house was empty. The man, the devil, was gone. They never found him. The police chalked it up to some kind of gruesome home invasion. But I knew the truth. He had been following me the whole night, maybe longer, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. He had wanted me to see, to know. He chose me for some reason. That was last Halloween, when my life was forever changed. I'm terrified he's going to come back for me this Halloween. I'm terrified that at any moment I'm going to see that mask again. I still remember that Halloween night like it was yesterday, even though it was the fall of 1998. I was 13, still young enough to trick or treat, but old enough to know it would probably be my last year. You know, that awkward age where you're not a kid anymore, but not quite ready to let go of the things you love. Yeah, I was right there. My best friends, Josh and Ethan, and I had made plans weeks in advance. It wasn't just about the candy. Halloween in our town was a huge deal. Streets would be packed with children, and parents partied while kids ruled the night, running through lawns with half-assed costumes, causing mischief. The houses were decorated to the max, with fake spiderwebs stretching across porches, jack-o'-lanterns flickering orange on every step, and skeletons hanging from trees. And the air, it had that crisp bite, just cold enough to see your breath when you exhaled, but not so cold you needed more than a sweatshirt. You could smell the damp earth, fallen leaves, the chocolate, and a little something else, that scent of plastic from store-bought costumes. Man, it was perfect. The three of us had met up at Josh's house as soon as dusk started to creep in. His parents were hosting one of those Halloween parties for grown-ups, the kind where they hand out apple cider to the kids and spiked cider for themselves. We had on our last-minute costumes, nothing fancy. Ethan had thrown on a scream mask, Josh was a zombie, and I was wearing a cheap Batman cape with a black hoodie. We hit the houses on our street first just to get things going. The wind rustled the orange and yellow leaves at our feet as we walked, and you could hear them tumble along the pavement. The sun had just about disappeared, leaving behind this deep purple hue in the sky, the last light of day slowly fading away. Porch lights flicked on, and soon we were moving through the first wave of trick-or-treaters, those little kids with their parents holding pillowcases already stuffed with candy. The sounds of giggling, the wind blowing through the trees, the occasional shriek from someone who got spooked by a fake ghoul on someone's lawn. It felt like Halloween in its purest form. After a few blocks, we made our way to Franklin Street. Now, Franklin wasn't like the other streets. It had the biggest houses, old Victorians that had been there for over a century. They always went all out for Halloween, each house trying to one-up the other with elaborate decorations and bowls filled with full-sized candy bars. All of the houses on Franklin Street looked like they came straight out of a Halloween movie. All except one, the Mallow House. Everyone in town knew about the Mallow place. It was creepy all year round, not just Halloween. The house had been built sometime in the 1800s, 3 stories tall with an overgrown yard that looked like it hadn't been mowed since before I was born. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Mallow, were an older couple who never came outside. I think I saw Mr. Mallow once or twice picking up mail, but he was always gone before I could say hello. As we got closer to Franklin, Josh nudged me. "Give you a handful of candy if you knock on the door at the Mallow place this year." I laughed it off. "Psych! And then what, get murdered?" But deep down, I was feeling that familiar pull, the dare, the challenge. It wasn't Halloween without doing something a little stupid, right? We made our way down Franklin Street, along with all the other trick-or-treaters. There was a constant buzz of chatter and laughter as we joined the crowd moving slowly down the sidewalk. The Mallow House loomed ahead of us as we made our way closer to it, sitting completely dark. The gate at the front of the yard was open, the path leading up to the front porch covered in a layer of wet leaves. As usual, there were no decorations. No fake cobwebs, no plastic tombstones, no pumpkins. But it didn't need scary decorations. The house was scary enough on its own. I didn't even have to say it aloud. We all knew it was next. Josh and Ethan started slowing down as we got closer, and I could feel the shift in the air. The excited banter between us had faded to an awkward silence. It was that kind of house that no one really talked about, but everyone knew to just stay away. You always passed by a little quicker, maybe glanced at it out of the corner of your eye, but you never lingered. It wasn't because it was haunted. There were no ghost stories. It was just creepy. People whispered about the Mallows, mostly rumors. Mr. Mallow was some kind of veteran, though no one was sure, and Mrs. Mallow was even more of a mystery. Some said she had dementia and was shut up in one of the upstairs rooms. Others swore she was dead. Either way, no one had seen her in years. "I'm not going up there. They're freaking weirdos," Ethan said. He tried to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in his voice. Josh kicked at the sidewalk, trying to act like he wasn't bothered. I glanced up at the house. A hulking Victorian with peeling paint, sagging roof, and windows that seemed too narrow, like they were squinting down at you. Every year, that house stood there, untouched by Halloween's spirit. No pumpkins, no lights, nothing. Josh, of course, wasn't going to let it go. He had this thing about proving himself, especially if Ethan and I were around. That year, we'd spent most of our afternoons watching Faces of Death tapes in his basement, trying to outdo each other's tolerance for gore. He'd never admit it, But this wasn't about candy. It was about who would back down first. He nudged me, a grin plastered on his face. "I'll go if you go." My stomach nodded, but I wasn't about to back down, not in front of them. "Fine," I muttered. "But we're in and out. We knock, get the candy, and leave." Ethan looked between us, clearly not thrilled, but he wasn't about to be the only one to chicken out. "Let's just make it quick," he said. "I don't want to hang around this place." We crossed the street and made our way toward the Mallow house. The closer we got, the colder it seemed to get, as if the place had its own climate. I could feel the dampness in the air now, the earthy smell from the neglected garden mixed with the scent of old wood. Our footsteps crunched softly, and the sound seemed to disappear into the thick silence surrounding the house. When we reached the gate, we paused. The iron bars were rusty, and the gate itself hung crooked on its hinges, like it hadn't been opened in years. But tonight, it was ajar, just wide enough for us to slip through. Josh, ever the brave one, was the first to step inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to thicken. I followed, feeling the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on me. Ethan brought up the rear, looking back over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting something or someone to jump out from behind the bushes. The porch creaked under our weight as we climbed the steps. I could see the door now, a massive oak thing with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. It looked ancient, the kind of thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. The windows were dark, covered with heavy curtains that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from behind them. I reached out and grabbed the knocker. I hesitated for a second, my hand hovering over the cold brass, before bringing it down with a loud thunk. The sound echoed through the house, hollow and unsettling. We waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the yard, but inside the house, there was only silence. Josh shot us a look, trying to play it cool, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "Well," he whispered, "I guess no one's home." Ethan turned to leave. "Sorry, guys. Nope. Peace out." But before he could leave, we heard it. The faint creak of floorboards, like someone shifting their weight inside. We froze. Another creak, closer this time. Then the soft click of the lock being turned. The door opened slowly, inch by inch, until it revealed a narrow gap. No light came from inside, just darkness so thick it felt like it could swallow us whole. And then a voice, low, raspy. "Come in." I glanced at Josh, expecting him to make some stupid joke and bolt, but his face had gone pale. Ethan took a step back, muttering under his breath. "Hell no, man. No way." But before any of us could move, the door opened wider. Standing there in the doorway was Mr. Mallow. He looked even older than I expected, more skeletal. His skin was waxy, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes? You couldn't see them. They looked hollow, empty, shadows cast around them like two black holes. He didn't smile, didn't offer any kind of greeting, just stood there staring at us. His clothes were dirty, stained in patches I couldn't identify, and his hands were covered in something dark, like oil. My stomach turned as I tried to make sense of it all. trick or treat," Josh said weakly, his voice cracking. Mr. Mallow's gaze flicked down to Josh, then back to me, and finally to Ethan. His lips twitched, like he was trying to smile but had forgotten how. Slowly, he raised one hand, motioning for us to come inside. "You boys are just in time," he rasped. "We've been waiting." I felt something cold run down my spine. We? Ethan stepped back again, his voice barely audible. "Let's go. Now." But before we could move, something shifted in the shadows behind Mr. Mallow. I couldn't see it at first, just the movement. Something dark. Then, slowly, as my eyes adjusted, I began to make it out. It was Mrs. Mallow, or what was left of her. We stood frozen at the door, eyes locked on the sight before us. Mrs. Mallow was hunched over at the kitchen table, barely illuminated by the dim light. At first glance, she almost looked normal. Just an old woman sitting down for a quiet meal, her thin hands resting limply on the table as though she'd been waiting for someone, waiting for us. But then I saw it, the way her body sagged, like something inside her was giving way, crumpling. Her head lolled to the side, neck bent at an impossible angle, and her body seemed to deflate, slumping lower as if gravity was pulling her apart piece by piece. Her skin, pale and waxy under the faint light, clung loosely to her bones, too loose, sagging in folds as though her flesh was simply draped over a frame that was barely holding together. She didn't move at first, just sat there, her empty eyes staring at us. But then there was this sound. It was low at first, a faint crinkling noise. Mrs. Mallow began to shift, slowly, horribly. Her legs seemed to twitch, her knees jerking unnaturally beneath the table as her whole body started to fold in on itself, collapsing in slow motion. Her back arched, her spine pushing out against her thin skin, the bones grinding and popping as if they were breaking apart, rearranging themselves in ways they weren't supposed to. She was twisting, contorting, her limbs bending into unnatural angles as her body crumpled lower and lower until she finally poured out of the chair, hitting the floor with a dull thud. For a second, she didn't move, just lay there in a heap, her limbs splayed out, her chest heaving in shallow, rasping breaths. Then, slowly, horrifyingly, she began to crawl. Her hands slapped against the floor, too fast, too eager, like some twisted animal skittering across the ground. Her skin, that loose, sagging skin, dragged behind her as she moved, sticking to the floor in patches, like it was melting off her bones. She crawled on all fours, her body twitching with each movement, but her head stayed locked on us. Those empty, hollow eyes fixed on us, unwavering, like she could see us, even though there was nothing there behind them, nothing but blackness. Her mouth hung open, jaw unhinged, but instead of words, a wet, gurgling sound bubbled up from her throat, thick and choking, like she was trying to speak, but something inside her was broken. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My legs were locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body just wouldn't listen. She was getting closer, too fast, her hands slapping against the ground, her joints popping and grinding with every jerking movement. And her face, God, her face. It was rotting, decaying, skin peeling away from her cheeks in thick, wet strips, revealing the gray flesh beneath. The stench hit us then, thick and rancid, the unmistakable smell of something long dead, something that had been festering in the dark for far too long. Josh let out a strangled gasp, his voice barely a whisper, and he grabbed at my sleeve. "Run," he said, his words trembling. "Now!" But I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She was almost at the door now, her gnarled fingers reaching out toward us, clawing at the air, reaching out for us. Suddenly, her body convulsed, her back arching violently as her whole frame shuddered. Then she collapsed again, her head hitting the floor with a sickening crack. But she didn't stop. She kept coming, crawling, scraping, inching closer and closer. Josh was the first to break. He shoved past us, bolting down the steps and back toward the street. Ethan and I were right behind him, not looking back, just running as fast as we could. I could hear the door creak shut behind us, but no footsteps followed, just that horrible silence. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the block, gasping for breath, hearts pounding in our chests. I glanced back at the Mallow house, half expecting to see them standing there, watching us, or worse, chasing us. But the porch was empty, the door closed. We didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there, gulping down cold air, staring back at the Mallow house, expecting something. But nothing happened. The place was dark and silent again, like it had always been. I could still see the faint glimmer of that dim porch light, but otherwise, it was just another shadow on the street. Ethan was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse, shaky. "What the hell was that? Did you see that? What was that?" Josh didn't answer. He was bent over, hands on his knees, still catching his breath. But I could see it in his face. He saw it too. He was more freaked out than I'd ever seen him. That cocky grin he always had was gone, replaced by the look of a scared child. I swallowed, my mouth dry. My brain was still trying to catch up with what I'd seen. That thing. That couldn't have been her. Not really. No one's body was supposed to look like that. The way she moved, the way she looked, the image was burned into my mind, and I felt vomit forming in my throat. Josh straightened up, finally breaking the silence. "That wasn't normal," he said, his voice flat. "There's no way that was normal." "What do we do?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide, darting between Josh and me. "We can't just leave it like this. What if someone else goes there tonight? That wasn't just some crazy old couple. That was..." Josh cut him off, his voice hard. "We're not doing anything. We're going home, and we're forgetting this ever happened." Are you serious?" I blurted out. "We can't just pretend we didn't see that. What if something's really wrong in there? What if they need help?" Josh whipped around, glaring at me. "Did they look like they wanted help to you? That was messed up, man. I'm not going back there, and you shouldn't either. It's not our problem." I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in Josh's eyes shut me up. He wasn't being a tough guy anymore. He was scared, really scared. And maybe he was right. What could we even do? Call the cops? Tell them what? Ethan was biting his lip, his hands shaking. Man, I just want to go home. Let's go. We started walking, fast at first, like we could outrun the memory of that house, of Mrs. Mallow's twisted body. But it stuck with me, clinging to the back of my mind like a nightmare I couldn't shake. By the time we reached Josh's place, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving us exhausted and rattled. We didn't even bother to check the rest of our candy haul. The excitement of the night had soured, curdled into something darker, something we didn't want to talk about. Josh's parents were still in the living room when we barged in, laughing with their friends, oblivious to what had just happened. For a second, the normalcy of it made me feel unhinged, like maybe we had imagined the whole thing. But I knew we hadn't. I could still see the way Mrs. Mallow's body moved, like a puppet with tangled strings. "I'm going to bed," Josh muttered, not even bothering to say goodnight. Ethan and I mumbled something in return, but no one was in the mood for conversation. We were all too busy replaying what had just happened, trying to make sense of it. Ethan and I headed upstairs to Josh's room, but neither of us bothered to change into pajamas or unpack our sleeping bags. We just laid there, staring at the ceiling. Every creak in the house, every groan of the floorboards made my heart jump. I kept picturing Mrs. Mallow's face. No, not her face. Her mask. That's what it looked like. A mask stretched too tight over something rotten underneath. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been watching us. Not just looking at us, but really seeing us. Like she'd marked us somehow. It was a stupid thought, but it stuck with me all night. I was terrified I'd wake up and she'd be standing over me. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were a mess of dark hallways, twisted bodies and eyes. Those hollow, empty eyes staring through me. When I woke up the next morning, my skin was slick with cold sweat, my heart still pounding. We didn't talk about the Mallow house the next day. Not really. Josh was quiet, distant, which wasn't like him. He usually couldn't stop running his mouth, but now he just mumbled answers, kept his eyes down, and didn't crack a single joke. Ethan left early, muttering something about having to help his dad with some yard work, but I knew he just wanted to be out of there. I didn't blame him. The whole thing felt like we'd stumbled into something humans weren't supposed to see. I left soon after, walking back to my house in the cold autumn sunlight. But the daylight didn't help. The world felt quieter, heavier. I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling sitting in my chest, like something bad was coming for me. That night, I kept thinking about what Mr. Mallow had said. We've been waiting. Waiting for what? Why had they opened the door for us? I tried to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave. Every shadow seemed a little too dark. Every creak of the house a little too loud. I didn't sleep well for days. And then, about a week later, I heard the news. Mr. and Mrs. Mallow were dead. It wasn't until the smell started leaking out of the house that the neighbors called someone to check on them. They found Mr. Mallow dead in his recliner. He had been dead for weeks. But Mrs. Mallow? They found her body upstairs, in a chair, rotting. The coroner said she must have been dead for at least a year. Mr. Mallow had never told anyone. But I saw her. I saw both of them. We all did, that night. I swear we saw her moving, walking, staring at us with those dead eyes. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't explain what we saw. Josh wouldn't talk about it. Neither would Ethan. We all just went back to our lives, pretending like it hadn't happened. But it stayed with us, lingering in the back of our minds, a memory we didn't want but couldn't shake. The town boarded up the house and left it to rot. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to even get close enough to tear it down. But every year near Halloween, when the air turns cold and the leaves start to fall, I think about that night, about what we saw, about what really happened in that house. That sound, that wet crunch of her body as it hit the floor, it's burned into my memory. I swear I can still hear it sometimes, like an echo in the back of my mind. I had been right. That was, in fact, the last year I ever went trick-or-treating.